All right, so in this next chapter, we're going to start talking about skylights. And when we're talking about skylights, we're going to be using this scene here, which is again an object or some kind of a house or something that is inside of a large space. I kind of like the idea of using these spaces that are downward, sort of canyon-like spaces, because they provide a great method of doing global illumination or illustrating aspects of global illumination when doing exterior scenes. So for now, let's just start with the basic concept that this is a scene that has no light in it, and it's going to be only illuminated by a skylight. So let's look at that concept. So to start that, let's imagine first of all that this is a space that basically has no light. So if we look at that in the scene, let's say there's absolutely no light in this scene, and we're not going to have any light at all. And if we go ahead and render this, and this is just in a straightforward scanline render out of 3D Studio, we will notice that basically it renders with black. So what that actually, basically here you go, background light, ambient light, nothing at all. So if it renders with black, so that color all over the place. And the main reason you're not getting any definition is because there is no self-shadowing. It's just blasting the entire scene with this light. And generally speaking, that tends to just flatten out the image. And it's obviously not the direction you want to go, but just conceptually speaking, that's what it is. So what we have to do is we have to create the self-shadowing, or the light that's bouncing around in this area. So let's start with that concept. And we'll do that by switching this out to a different rendering engine and start looking at it in terms of just skylight situations. Okay, so now what we've done is we've reopened our scene, and we've opened it in same scene in 3D Studio, but we switched our rendering engine out to V-Ray. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to open up the rendering option, and I'm going to show basically how we set up a skylight. And there's several ways to do it. I mean, there's the obvious way would be just go to environment and you actually enter in a color. But a more practical way, because you don't always want to do a color for the entire scene, you want to sort of just do it for the skylight. So what you can do is basically, here's using our default anti-aliaser, but for there's a V-Ray environment here, and I'm doing max override, and I've assigned a slight color to that environment. And by doing that, it's going to allow light to sort of come in using just a GI, and it says here GI environment skylight. So now that I've done that, I'm selecting my indirect illumination, which is my GI, and I've turned that on. And my primary bounce, we're going to use the irradiance map method, and my secondary bounce, I'm going to select none, which basically means that there's only going to be one bounce of light. And when I've done that, I'm also going to look in the irradiance map, and you remember from our settings before, I'm setting this to low, and I'm doing a show calc phase to show you guys the calc phase of the process. And one other thing I've done is under frame buffer here, I'm actually overriding, and I'm going to use the V-Ray frame buffer because it's going to help me illustrate another point for you guys. So, all right, now that we've done that, we're going to get ready to render. When you actually look at this render, the first reaction you have is that it is very, very dark. Well, the reason being is that this is set to linear monitor space. And in order to compensate for that, we want to set it to an sRGB color space, which is the correct gamma for this monitor. And so what you've done, it is a great trick that Rob Niederhaus has written to sort of get the camera trick that allows me to sort of put the gamma curve back into the image, since this is a floating point image. So by doing that, I can go in here, and this is the curve, and I can actually apply that curve, and it brings back the correct camera curve that I need in this particular image. Now you're saying, okay, that's great, it's brighter here, but it's still fairly dark in here. There's a big reason for that. This is basically the process which we've used, where we've only doing one bounce of light, is basically what's known as an ambient occlusion pass when we're doing a skylight. And the ambient occlusion is going to have a real problem trying to get any light up here given this particular scene. Because we're in this canyon, in this little slot here, there is going to be no way we're going to be able to get any skylight to come in here. The only way that's going to happen is if light bounces inside of these spaces. So it can work, you know, great to get these sort of soft contact shadows and stuff in here, but it really doesn't work well at all for here. By the way, the lack of detail is because we have this set to low, so we're going to set it to high later on in the process. But anyway, the big point is that we need to start to add more light in here by actually getting light to bounce around. So let's look at what happens when we do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our rendering engine here, and I'm going to select basically my indirect illumination, and I'm going to go with the quasi-Monte Carlo secondary for my secondary bounces. And in doing that, I'm going to turn that down to just one. I'm just going to do one bounce of light and see where that goes. And actually, let's go in here and see how long the last rendering took, and I'm going to be able to turn that on right there. So it took 27 seconds to do the last one. And so let's look at this now and do it with the bounces, with one bounce of light. And already we start to see that light is filling itself out in a much better way. We don't have that strange dark area that we had here. We're starting to get light penetrated through here. Obviously now we have light here, which is great. And it's basically only taken about 10 seconds extra to be able to do this. Well, let's take this again, and let's increase our quality overall in our scene. So I'm actually going to go into my radiance map here, and I'm going to go to the high setting, and I'm going to go to 50 bounces, because I really want to show, you know, how this looks correctly. And I'm going to, you know, like I've done in the past, I'm going to pause the video as it goes through because it may start to take too long. So I'm going to hit render, and I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. Okay, and we're back, and basically the rendering here now is 1 minute and 39 seconds, which is longer, obviously, but there's a lot more detail that we've accomplished. We've gotten these shadows that are coming up here, we've got this contact stuff that's going on here. Just everything seems to be a little bit richer in terms of how it's supposed to look. And our light is bouncing on inside here, you know, starting to get quite nice. But let's carry it a little bit further and really start to take this up a notch, and we'll actually go into our rendering, and what we'll do is go in and actually add more bounces of light. So we'll go back to our secondary bounces, and which would be the quasi-Monte Carlo, and we're going to add more secondary bounces to this effect, and I'm actually going to go ahead and go to 10. So keep in mind our last render was 1 minute and 39, and I'm actually going to do 10 bounces of light and see how the rendering time is affected by that, and see how the quality changes as well. So let's go ahead and hit render, and I'm going to once again pause the video. And we're back, and we'll notice that we actually start to have more light in here. And it started to really start to penetrate in the space, and it's starting to go in there. It's still very dark, but we actually have some definition that we can see. So 10 bounces of light, and we're up only to 2 minutes and 18 seconds on this render, which isn't bad at all. And it's really kind of getting us in the zone that we want to be. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I'm going to start to see that, but I still need to add more light. And the big difference also is that we're sort of getting just monotone gray concept here, and we want to kind of fight that aspect as well. So let's look at how we can add more light in this situation, even though we're not using any light in the scene whatsoever. So there are basically two ways we can try to add more light in a scene that doesn't use any light. So what we can do is we can go in here, and what I'm going to do is go back to my environment light, which was here, and you see there's a multiplier on it, and basically all that's saying is it's giving a color, a slight blue tint, and it's only giving a multiplier 1. So actually let's just go ahead and do a multiplier of 2, and we'll show you real quick what that does. So we'll go ahead and render. And you'll notice that basically the scene is a lot brighter, and we've gotten a lot more light in the space. But you'll also notice another key thing is that the rendering time has gone up. And there is a key reason that actually is almost doubled. The reason that is that as you remember, in our rendering engine is basically adaptive, right? So if we actually look at this and remember that basically the Quasi-Monte Carlo sampler is trying to be adaptive and actually has a minimum amount of rays. But if you shoot brighter scenes, it cannot cut down the amount of rays that it uses. And I remember when I said that basically it's shooting, it would never actually shoot 50 rays unless it had to. Well, in a condition where it's brighter, it actually does have to shoot more rays. So it does actually take longer to render. So that's an interesting concept. And basically all we've done now is we've added more light, and it just had to get around and shoot them along a lot more. But I also want to bring up another point, another way that you can get things to be brighter. And but it will also kind of have the same effect. But it's just something to keep in mind when you're doing these exercises. So let's take that back to 1. If we take that back to 1, the other thing I want to do is I want to actually go in here and go ahead and render this particular scene. So again, we've got our GI multiplier down to 1, and we'll hit render one more time. And we'll pause. All right, well, there's two major things you'll notice have happened. One is the scene has gotten incredibly bright, and that's because this is 100% white, and the light just continues to, you know, bounce around in here and loses very little energy, which is how we were able to get so much light. Is basically our middle gray in terms of our shader, and our light is back to 1. So this is kind of, the neutral look that we had. Here's the issue. You may want to try to get more light in here, but you want to keep with the idea of, this whole skylight. Well, the big key thing to do when you're doing this is not to revert back to what I will call old habits. When you're doing global illumination, one of the key ways to start thinking about strategies in terms of lighting is how do you actually get light in this zone inside of these little areas without having to add more light. And the big thing to always try to keep in mind is always ask yourself this question: what would you do in the real world? As in, if you're going to shoot this with a real camera or whatever you're going to do, and you're going to try to get more light in here, the best way to do that would be to use a reflector, right? So a large white card that will reflect diffuse light back into our scene. So that's actually exactly what we're going to do. So let's take a look at what we can do in this particular situation. What I've done is the following. Let's say I've taken this scene, right? Here's our scene, and that's our camera, and that's how kind of it's set up. And I'm actually going to unhide an object that I have, and I call it card, okay? And what this card actually is just a very large card, and it's only it's got normals only pointing up, right? It's not pointing down or anything else. And so basically it's just one particular plane that's pointing in the this kind of has a 45-degree angle. So basically light will bounce off this card and go inside of here. Now, as we already know, if we have something that's intensity of 255, meaning 100% bright, it's going to reflect light a lot more. So that's the first step that we've done. We've actually gone in there and we've assigned that card a white shader where it's just pure white. Okay, and the next thing we want to do is apply one more thing to it, because having done this, I know that basically it's going to help, but it's not going to provide us enough. So we actually need to boost the amount of reflection off of this even more. And I'm going to do that by, if you go to the actual object and you do your V-Ray properties, you can access that window several ways. One way to do it would be to go into the rendering, and at the system you can do object settings, and I have my card selected. But anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. I'm actually going to do generate GI, actually apply a multiplier to that. So it's going to shoot 3 times more GI samples than it would normally out of that. And what I'm also going to do is the following. I'm going to take the object, and under the object utilities, I am going to make sure that it's not visible to camera, because in fact if I look through the camera it's actually blocking my camera. But nonetheless, we're ready to go, and what I'm going to do is let's look at what happens here once we've applied those settings. So we'll go back and we'll hit render again, and let's see what goes on. And as you can see, what it's done is actually reflected light back into our scene. It's actually affected more than just this area, which is kind of what we wanted, is a reflected backlight in here and in here, etc. But as you remember, because we're bouncing more light off of things, it has affected our rendering time again, but it's concentrated the light the way we wanted it to be concentrated. So it's kind of an effective way of working sometimes. If we want to try to get more light into some areas, but we want to get them in a specific way, think of using real-world situations and basically use concepts such as reflectors to actually reflect light back in your scene. Now, the other big problem that we have with this is that it's generally very flat, and the reason is that we're using one monochromatic color for our sky. So a good way to get ambient light in an area and not just make it so flat would be to not use one color, but to use something a little more special in terms of our light, and that's what we're going to cover in our next chapters. It's the use of high dynamic range images for lighting.